Hello, and welcome to this month's Europe Inside Out. I'm your host, Rym Momtaz, the editor-in-chief of Strategic Europe, Carnegie Europe's blog, where twice a week we publish punchy short analysis on all things strategic in Europe. Today, we'll be exploring enlargement and the EU's Black Sea strategy, two highly strategic issues for the EU's ability to effectively contain and counter Russia's increasing belligerence. And we'll be doing so by delving into the situations in Georgia and Moldova. We'll start with an overview and assessment of the state of play in both countries. In Georgia, there's been a pro-Russian tilt, or perhaps a move away from the EU, and mass street protests have gripped the country since late November, when the ruling Georgian Dream Party's increasingly authoritarian government said it would freeze EU accession talks until 2028, even though accession is a goal enshrined in the constitution and supported by 80% of the population. In Moldova, President Maia Sandu was re-elected last year despite evidence of a Moscow-run massive campaign against her. But Russia's attempts at destabilization haven't ended. They're now trying to trigger an economic and political tension ahead of parliamentary elections later this year. We'll then move on to assessing how the current situation can and might impact the EU's enlargement and Black Sea strategies. So I'm delighted to do so with two of our best scholars on these issues. Tom Duvall, our senior fellow specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region, and Dimitar Bichev, our senior fellow who focuses on EU enlargement, the Western Balkans, and Eastern Europe. Welcome both. Tom, let's start with what is happening in Georgia today.
So let's contrast beginning of 2025 with beginning of 2024. A year ago, all three countries seemed to be on a positive accession track. Georgia a bit behind, but it had been given candidate status by the EU. There was going to be an election which did take place in Georgia, and quite high hopes that the Georgian Dream Party was unpopular, that an opposition coalition might take its place. All of that really crumbled in 2024. There was evidence of mass fraud in the election. Georgian Dream claimed victory. The opposition is now boycotting. And we've got this long-running crisis in Georgia, accentuated by the fact that Georgian Dream is now suspending EU accession. We've now got two presidents in Georgia. There's the new Georgian Dream nominated president, a guy called Mikhail Kavalishvili, a former footballer, not a respected man in Georgia or the West, we have to say, but elected president on the 29th of December. And there's the outgoing president, Salome Zurabashvili, also a French citizen in the past, who says that she's still the legitimate president because the new president lacks that legitimacy. So we've got this long-running crisis, and no one seems to have come out on top. There's still protests, but Georgian Dream is kind of riding out the protests as best it can. Threat of sanctions from the US, which may be followed by EU countries. So a real mess, and I guess the EU not doing so much, maybe because it's got its hands full elsewhere. But basically, this crisis continues to unfold.
And interestingly, I mean, we've seen that the State Department has already imposed sanctions on the founder of Georgian Dream, where obviously, as you said, the EU hasn't really moved yet. But what we did see is that Viktor Orban, who had the rotating presidency of the EU Council when this election happened, actually broke ranks with the EU and congratulated Georgian Dream and went to Georgia. How is that playing out right now in terms of the standoff that we're seeing?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing, I think, some people describe this as a pro-Russia strategy. I think what's happening is obviously that Georgia is de facto moving closer to Russia because it's moving away from the EU and the rest of the West. But it's more like a Serbia strategy. What we're seeing is a government that wants to play all sides. It wants a better relation with Russia. It wants Chinese money, and it wants friends in Europe. And its chief friend in Europe is, of course, Viktor Orban, with whom they'd cultivated ties over many years. They're, of course, also watching Washington, because they see a possible axis of illiberal values that will connect them to Washington as well. So they're kind of down with many Western actors, but they still see potential. And this is why this hedging strategy that we see, this kind of Serbia-style strategy, maybe they're also looking to countries like Azerbaijan and Turkey, looks attractive to them. They see a geopolitical environment which is more favorable to them than it would have been a year or two ago.
So I want to just drill down on one thing, because I think, Tom, you are a bit outside of the sort of grain on this, or the bubble think on this. A lot of people say, actually, what's happening in Georgia is a Russian-led strategy, that this is all Russia maneuvering. And you don't necessarily agree with that. You think that what's happening in Georgia is a little more complex than that. So let's just go back on that a bit.
For sure, it's more complicated than that. I mean, let's look at the last 30 years in which Georgia and Russia have basically been in a state of conflict in one way or another. They broke diplomatic relations in 2008 with the 5-day war between Georgia and Russia. And so Georgian Dream is a party that doesn't really mention the word Russia or Putin. They say there's a global party of war that wants to drag us into war in Ukraine. They talk about traditional values, but they're drawing on something quite Georgian there, support from the Georgian Orthodox Church, this kind of Orban-esque talk about values. And so the hints about Russia are hints that if Georgia was to restore diplomatic relations with Russia, seek to join Russian-led institutions, there would be a big backlash. We've seen a lot of the institutions in Georgia, whether the foreign ministry, the military, they don't like what's happening, but they're not going to rock the boat. But there are red lines that they don't want to see crossed. I think I see these Georgian Dream leaders as being actually pretty afraid of Russia. It's an appeasement strategy to Russia. They don't want the Russians to take them over, but they want to deal with the Russians. And of course, they want to make money with the Russians, as a lot of people do. I see it as more of an anti-Western strategy than a pro-Russian strategy.
All right, so let's shift maybe to Moldova, where I think we can all agree that there was clearly sort of a Russian-run attempt at influence and at defeating the pro-EU presidential candidate, Maia Sandu. Let's do the same. What's the overview there, Tom? What's happening in Moldova right now? What's the state of play, given that Maia Sandu was able to, perhaps miraculously in a certain way, win despite this Russian attack?
I think 2025 is going to be an absolutely critical year for Moldova. I urge people to pay a lot of attention to it. A lot is going to happen. We're going to see a parliamentary election there before July. I think the date is not fixed. And let's not forget that that's more important than the presidential election. Maia Sandu's party, PAS, has a big majority in parliament. If it loses that, then we're going to see a different government. We're going to see, for sure, a slowing down of the EU trajectory. We're going to see, political deadlock in Moldova. Not necessarily, again, a tilt towards Russia, but again, more of this kind of hedging strategy from a new government. And for sure, Russia is going to try and influence that election, as they did with the presidential election. But the other thing that's going on, which is absolutely critical, is from the 1st of January, Russian gas stopped transiting Ukraine. Ukraine wound up that agreement. That affects Moldova, and it particularly affects the breakaway territory of Transnistria, which was relying basically on free Russian gas to survive. Transnistrian factories are beginning to shut down. There's no heating in parts of Transnistria. That whole project, 30-year-old project of a kind of Russia-leaning breakaway bit of Moldova in Transnistria, is beginning to fail. That in some ways could be good news. It could lead to kind of reintegration of Transnistria into Moldova, but a lot of dangers there. In particular, a short-term danger is that Moldova has been getting cheap electricity thanks to that free gas agreement. There's a plant on the other side of the river in Moldova that supplies the rest of Moldova with cheap electricity. Suddenly, we might be seeing, thanks to this gas crisis in Transnistria, electricity prices shooting up across Moldova at the absolute worst moment for Maia Sandu and our government. And voters, even without the Russian interference, turning away from them because of a big energy crisis in Moldova itself.
Dimitar, I'm turning to you here because in our overview of what's happening in Georgia and in Moldova, the word enlargement or new enlargement and the EU path came up a lot. So I want to drill down on that bit because it strikes me as there are similarities, but also differences between the both situations in Moldova and in Georgia. And in Georgia, it seems to me that there's a deliberate choice now by Georgian Dream to kind of turn away from the enlargement path, from the EU path, and maybe try to hedge, as Tom was saying, try to get the benefits from being adjacent to the EU, but without going through this very long process of enlargement. Whereas in Moldova, they're very much sticking to the enlargement path, and they're actually paying the price with, as we're seeing, more and more Russian subversive attacks against. What's your assessment, first of all, of what's going to happen with enlargement in Georgia and how the Georgian Dream Party is going to manage that?
Well, it seems to me they've given up, at least rhetorically, on the EU. But it doesn't mean it's over with they, because they're insisting they're still interested. By they, I mean Georgian Dream. It's just it has to happen on their own terms, as if it's the EU joining Georgia, not the other way around. But the truth is, as Tom put it, is that they feel vulnerable and their room for maneuver is much more limited. If we look at Moldova, you have the government and political elite who have cast their lot with the EU. But even if they are replaced, which is not unlikely following the parliamentary election, their likely successors from the now opposition won't do a Georgia Dream and won't write off the EU altogether. Rather, to my mind, they'll fall back to the multi-vectoring posture that previous Moldovan administration had. In other words, have a friendly or constructive tone vis-a-vis Moscow, but then proceed with the EU nonetheless and try to consolidate power. It won't be this radical scenario we've seen in Tbilisi.
And I just wanted to sort of remind our readers, because you say, just like Tom just said, that, they feel vulnerable in Georgia. And I think we need to remind people that Russia continues to occupy about 20% of Georgia. So there's a real threat, actually. Georgian Dream, is talking about. It's not just something that they're using as an excuse. But it makes me think, what does that mean about the continued attractiveness of EU enlargement for countries that are on the border of Russia and who today are perhaps now wanting to make a different choice, walking away from EU enlargement because of the Russian threat?
Well, geography matters is the succinct answer. If you look at where Moldova is on the map and look where Georgia is on the map, you understand the different responses to their predicament. I mean, Russia is virtually next door and is overlooking Tbilisi in terms of military deployment, whereas Moldova is far removed from the current battle line. If, God forbid, the Russians end up in Odessa, it will be a different calculus for Chisinau, but that's not the case. In fact, Russia, thanks to what Ukraine did in containing Russia, and is still been doing it, is hundreds of miles and thousands of miles away from there. Whereas the EU is a daily reality across the border with Romania, and the fact that so many Moldovans, including my son, who hold EU citizenship, makes a profound difference. It also reflected in the turnover in trade and also investment and remittances and what have you. So that explains to a large degree the attraction, because for Moldova, it's a fact of daily life. And it's as much true about the right bank of the Dniester River as it's for the left bank in Transnistria, where businesses export heavily to the EU and they are co-opted into the Eurosphere. So, long story short, even if we don't play EU's political agency as a security troubleshooter, it's a huge market and a huge magnet for society and business, and it will remain so for going forward.
And so you think that huge market and the big economic opportunity that is represented by the EU and getting into the EU space, is that enough to make up for the escalating, threat that Russia is now more and more explicitly forming against these countries? Is that enough?
It was enough. We don't have February 24th, 2022. In fact, the EU has to now reinvent itself as a geopolitical player in the crudest form of that, as a military or quasi-military power. So just offering an open door and trade is not enough. We've seen it time and again with Ukraine. In the Moldovan case, you signed a security partnership with Chisinau. Let's see how much of a difference it makes in terms of upgrading a security position. But also it's been providing energy and money, of course, to offset this current predicament Moldovans find themselves in. So that's not enough as well, but at least I think there is this realization in Brussels and key capitals that having EU as just a passive magnet for countries on its periphery is far than enough, because you have other guys like the Russians, but not only, who play the old school game of geopolitics and can send the bombers and missiles and little green men and establish facts on the ground in those territories and countries.
So before I jump off of this point, there is one actor that will loom large that's about to be inaugurated and that, is about to start his second administration, Donald Trump in the US. And we haven't really talked about him right now. I really wonder, Dimitar, because you're also an expert, obviously, on the Western Balkans. And there's one personality, one character in the Trump galaxy who's called Rick Grenell, who was during the first administration the person who built a lot of these business connections and networks in this part of Europe. And I just wonder, do you expect someone like Rick Grenell to delve into Georgia, Moldova? Is he going to try to create an opportunity there? Could he be a spoiler for EU plans and maybe come up with some third way or something like that?
That's one scenario for sure, because governments in that part of the world have a transactionist mindset as well. Some of those people never bought into the rule of law agenda, to put it mildly. And when they see a like-minded actor coming to power in Washington, that makes them click, that they could do business at the personal and group level mixed with foreign policy and get mileage in Washington. So that's a welcome realization. So I wouldn't be surprised if I see some outreach in Tbilisi. Potentially, if Moldova swings to the dark side, quote unquote, you'll see a similar type of wooing behavior. But you never know, because as you could expect, other governments, other leaders around the world will be playing the same game. So there will be huge demand for this personal, transactional engagement with the Trump administration. And you wouldn't be surprised to see the default standard issue for American foreign policy kicking in, with American diplomats, State Department taking the lead. Maybe not on Georgia, because geopolitical stakes are high and you have probably some scope for the top brass, i.e. Trump world getting involved, but certainly in Moldova. Now, there is a third wildcard there, somebody called Viktor Orban, who has long played the intermediary with such governments and parties and leaders in the Western Balkans. But also in Georgia, he was the one who went first to congratulate the Georgian dream, or Georgian nightmare, as their detractors call them, for their victory. Viktor Orban is close to American conservatives, also to Trump. He was name-checked in the debate with Kamala Harris. And he's likewise close to the Vucic's and the Dodik. He will be playing the intermediary. So if you want to knock on Trump's door, you might find out that the shortest way to the White House goes via Budapest. So he'll be the one steering those contacts and trying to all the wheels of commerce, foreign policy, and propose all kinds of initiatives and deals and investment opportunities, and try to help illiberal characters on the EU periphery have a better understanding with Washington as it morphs now.
Tom, I wanted to turn to you because in addition to enlargement, obviously, these two countries and what happens in them will have an impact on the Black Sea. And we're at a point right now with the Ukraine war where there's a lot of talk about, incoming President Trump figuring out some sort of resolution, ceasefire in Ukraine with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. If, and it's a big if, there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, there might be an impact on the Black Sea. Just to remind our listeners, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022, Turkey was able to close basically the Black Sea by using the Montreux Convention that allows them as a literal state to close the Black Sea to military ships because of a conflict. If the war in Ukraine is stopped or is frozen and Turkey decides to reopen the Black Sea again, what is the scenario that you see, first of all? And then we'll talk about what is the EU strategy and is there one to start with?
Yeah, for sure. The EU has identified the Black Sea as a critical region, both in security terms, in economic terms. Obviously, two littoral states, Bulgaria and Romania, potentially Ukraine and also Moldova and even Georgia joining in the future. And the reason that Ukraine has survived this war is the fact that Ukraine has managed to kind of damage or semi-destroy the Russian Black Sea fleet. Odessa has survived as Ukraine's main port and as a place from which to export its grain, previously under this UN deal and now without that UN deal. So Odessa, the Black Sea, absolutely critical to Ukraine. And that's really possible because Russia cannot rearm its Black Sea fleet because Turkey has closed the so-called Straits, the Bosphorus, that narrow channel that links the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Now, if there's a ceasefire and there is some kind of peace, Turkey will be under a lot of pressure and will do bargaining with Russia about reopening the Straits. And that could be a very, very critical and dangerous moment for Ukraine, because, let's imagine the worst case scenario, which is that Russia then rearms its Black Sea fleet. This ceasefire only lasts 6 months or a year. Russia goes back to war and this time has more military capacity to attack Odessa. Many other elements there. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's definitely something that should be on policymakers' radars.
And I guess this is where enlargement is also a geostrategic thing. I think Tom explained it very well. The idea behind the EU saying, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia are on a fast track to EU enlargement is also about securing that maneuvering space in the Black Sea and trying to prevent Russia from rebuilding that fleet and using it as an asset to attack the European space again. So I wonder, Dimitar, how do you assess today the ability of the EU to counter what Russia has done in Moldova, or what, let's say, the Georgian Dream's hedging position might do to the EU's enlargement approach, which is a precursor to its ability to be a strategic player in the Black Sea? How do you see that?
We shouldn't exaggerate it, the capacity of the EU to counteract this behavior. Because look, if you live in this growingly uncertain world, you might be a liberal government, you might be liberal or anything in between the gray zone. You want to hedge your bets. Things can go in the wrong direction. How do you do that? By keeping doors open. You have the Russians, you have the Chinese. What's new now is that the US and the EU might not be playing on the same team. So, as I wrote in a op-ed, Financial Times, just to plug it here, the US could become also part of this multipolar scenario, which is something new. We are not used to live in this world, but we experienced it in the Western Balkans with the first Trump administration. and you could play off one against the other if you're skillful enough. And this could go wrong as well, as people in Belarus found when Lukashenko failed to be the intermediary, had to attach his ship to Putin's after 2020. The EU is not a unitary actor, and Europeanization also means that candidate countries and their elites learn the EU ways, and they could build connections to individual governments and split the EU from within. That's why the sanction instrument is not applied consistently, that Georgians feel safe that even though the US sanctioned Ivanishvili and Bahidze and the rest of the group, the EU won't be following up with its own sanctions as long as Orban is there, but also Fico and others. So, yeah, I mean, multipolar hedging and balancing happens both in terms of other powers, but also vis-a-vis the various stakeholders in the EU as well. And I'm pretty sure you'll see some of that going forward.
I think this is like where I want to actually end this episode, Tom, because, you know, what Dimitar just said is that no matter how critical and strategic this space is and is becoming more and more for the EU's ability to shape local actions is extremely limited. So if you were advising the EU, what would you tell them to do moving forward in that space?
I don't think there's one silver bullet. I think you've got to continue to support these societies, which I think are, you know, basically pro-European in both places like Georgia and Moldova. I think you've got to, you know, keep up economic links. I think you've got to engage with a government like Georgian Dream. You don't want to drive them into the arms of the Russians. You don't want that to become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So, but clearly these difficult times, and a lot of it is going to be about strategic patience. It's not going to be about getting good outcomes. I'm afraid it's about getting less bad outcomes.
Tom, Dimitar, thank you very much. For those who are interested in learning more about Europe's East and the wider Black Sea region, I encourage you to follow the work of Carnegie Europe on X and LinkedIn. Our producer is Mattia Bagherini. Our editor is Futura Di Aprile of Europod. Sound engineering and original music by Jeremy Bouquet.